Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the real agenda behind Trump and Miller's immigration cruelty, which is to drive a wedge between the white working class and the brown working class and create Trump-friendly gangster states in Latin America, since Trump just helped elect Asfura in Honduras, along with the drug gang MS-13 he has railed against. The freeing of the drug kingpin Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, was a gift to Silicon Valley billionaires to give them free rein and sovereignty over so-called freedom cities like Prospera in Honduras that Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen are creating. Joining us is Jeet Guerrero, an opinion writer at the New York Times and previously an opinion columnist for the Los Angeles Times and an investigative border reporter for NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and other public media. The recipient of an Emmy, she began her career at the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires as a correspondent in Mexico City, and is the author of Crux, a cross-border memoir, and most recently, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. We'll discuss her latest article at the New York Times, Trump is not a nationalist, he's something worse. Then with Deputy Attorney General Blanche admitting he doesn't know why Tulsi Gabbard led the FBI raid to get the 2020 ballots in Fulton County, Georgia. We will speak with Jeet Heer, a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and host of the weekly Nation podcast, The Time of Monsters. He also pens the monthly column Morbid Symptoms, and we will discuss his latest article at The Nation, Tulsi Gabbard's Georgia raid is a pretext for future election intimidation. Then finally, we'll investigate Pam Bondi's arrest of the former CNN anchor Don Lemon, which should be a wake-up call to all journalists and media owners, and speak with Ann Nelson, an author and lecturer in the field of international affairs, media and human rights, who was the former head of the Committee to Protect Journalists and director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism, where she created the first curriculum in human rights reporting. Her books include Red Orchestra, The Berlin Underground, and The Circle of Friends Who Resisted Hitler, and Shadow Network, Media Money and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right, now out in an updated paperback version. And her new film, Bad Faith, The Christian Nationalists' War on Democracy, based on her book, Shadow Network, is streaming at Amazon. And a new version, out in 2 weeks, will be available at badfaithdocumentary.com. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now, Jeet Guerrero, who's a visiting professor at the USC Annenberg School of Journalism and an opinion columnist at the New York Times and formerly at the Los Angeles Times, and she was previously an investigative border reporter for NPR and PBS NewsHour and other public media. The recipient of an Emmy, she began her career at the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires as a correspondent in Mexico City, and is the author of Crux, a cross-border memoir, and most recently, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. And she has an op-ed at the New York Times, Trump is not a nationalist, he's something worse. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jeet Guerrero.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And your article is so disturbing because it makes the case that hardly needs to be made that Trump is a fraud and a liar. And for the reasons I don't understand, he still has a lot of support in this country. After all, he got elected twice. But the idea that the people that he railed against, particularly back in his first term, MS-13, the street gang that originated in Los Angeles and ended up as a curse in El Salvador and Honduras, he railed against them endlessly. But now we're learning from your op-ed in the New York Times, Jean, that he supported this drug-dealing ex-president of Honduras, who was given, I think, a 45-year sentence in an American jail. He sprung him from the jail, sent him back to Honduras to help get his nationalist parties elected. The candidate, Nasri Asfura, known as Tito or Papi, Daddy. And how did this guy get elected? Through the help of MS-13. So I just find it extraordinary. Why isn't there more outrage in this country?
I mean, honestly, I think it's part of the problem are the echo chambers and the fact that people, in the rare cases when they do get information that is outside of their world's view, they just kind of dismiss it as fake news. I mean, I find it astonishing that Donald Trump pardoned. I started looking into the pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez because I just wanted to understand how it squared with everything else that Trump and Stephen Miller seemingly or claim to stand for, not just because of the fact that he was convicted for one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world, but also because he oversaw one of the largest waves in family migration from Honduras to the United States. And Donald Trump and Stephen Miller supposedly stand for restricting immigration, for cracking down on cartels. And this pardon just showed that that was a complete farce. And I wanted to understand what it was about. And ultimately, it's about supporting a class of transnational elites who believe that they're above the law in Honduras and protecting their ability to continue various neocolonial experiments that are displacing people from their indigenous communities for the profit of transnational corporations that operate, in my opinion, like cartels.
Well, there's also the foreign policy dimension, Gene, where he and Miller and Hegseth are trying to gin up a war against Venezuela and blowing up so-called drug boats. And here he is justifying intervention in Venezuela based upon the war on drugs. And yet, at the same time, he frees one of the biggest drug dealers in history, who sprung from an American prison. It just didn't add up. And I'm astounded why people didn't see the flagrant hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, some people notice the hypocrisy and were wondering how is it possible? Why is he pardoning this major drug trafficker at the same time as he's going after Venezuela's president on alleged drug trafficking charges? Why is he threatening the Colombian president on alleged drug trafficking charges at the same time as he's aligning himself with MS-13 in Honduras? It doesn't make any sense. But the fact is that it kind of does make sense because at the end of the day, it's about expanding control for these massive corporations of the land and resources in these countries. And they do so by installing people who are friendly to American interests and to their right to extract and exploit with impunity. And that is kind of what ties it all together.
Well, let's talk about that, particularly in the context of the sort of artificial war against the white working class and the brown working class, who should actually be in solidarity. It's pretty clear that Stephen Miller, is waging a war against the brown working class, and we've seen the cruelty of ICE breaking up families and killing American citizens. And clearly Stephen Miller is no friend of the white working class. But that's where all these dog whistles associated with ICE are about, aren't they? To drive a wedge between the white working class in America and the brown working class?
Exactly. I mean, and that's part of what I argue in my op-ed, that the only way we're going to be able to sort of find our way out of this is if the left starts to articulate a politics that connects immigrant rights and workers' rights. Right now, the only party that appears to talk about immigrant rights and labor rights in the same sentence is the Republican Party, and they often frame them as being at odds. Like they talk about how undocumented immigrants depress wages for working class Americans. And many on the left are afraid to talk about that because they don't want to unwittingly fuel hatred against immigrants. But the thing is that if the Democratic Party is not prioritizing a pathway to legalization and talking about the reasons that we need that, which is so that we can have economic equality in this country and so that we don't have a manufactured underclass, then Stephen Miller is going to continue to be able to paint Democrats and liberals and progressives as elites who only care about immigrants as a source of cheap labor. And the only way to break that narrative is for Democrats to prioritize a pathway to legalization for this manufactured underclass that will make it a lot harder for corporations to continue to exploit and pit working class Americans against immigrants.
So this is a combination then of Trump's vision of a kind of Western Hemisphere. I mean, he's clearly in Putin's pocket, and Putin and his ideological advisor Dugin have come up with this notion of the world divided like mafia bosses. You know, Xi Jinping, you get Asia; Vladimir, you get Russia, and as much as you can grab in Eastern and Western Europe. And I Don get the Western Hemisphere. And Trump clearly is comfortable with people like Bolsonaro, who's a crook in Brazil. He's just helped elect this crook in Honduras by freeing the former president of the National Party. And he seems to be quite comfortable with the same bunch of crooks in Venezuela after knocking off the head of the criminal family running Venezuela. So that's pretty clear where he's at. But then you have this other dimension, I guess represented in a way by Vice President Vance, who's close to the Silicon Valley bros. They've got this experiment underway in this island in Honduras, which they have sovereignty over, Prospera. And that seems to be the 1-2 punch that we're heading into. That is their vision of sort of criminal oligarchic states that are friendly to business, and sovereignty is a is a bygone notion.
Exactly. I mean, that's what's really illuminating about this story is that Trump claims to be about borders. He claims to be a nationalist, but his pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras and his election interference there on behalf of Natsur Yasfura is blatantly about Prospera in Rotan, which is about destroying the notion of sovereignty. The people who are behind startup cities like Prospera openly talk about wanting these territories to not only compete with nations, but to someday replace them. They want a world in which corporations are in charge and above the law, and there is no rule of law, and they get to dictate the terms. And in places like Rotan, they get to extract and they get to do whatever they want and set their own regulations without paying almost any taxes to Honduras. And this is an experiment that they want to bring to the United States. They've been talking to Trump about doing similar experiments, which in this case they brand them as freedom cities, but it's the same thing. They're these semi-autonomous cities that operate outside of national sovereignty, and they want to bring them to the United States, and Trump has openly advocated for them. So if you still believe that Trump is a nationalist, it's just it's absurd. It's clearly not the case when you look at what he's doing in Latin America and the way that all of these acts of interference connect. And it really is scary because what they're doing south of the border is what they plan to do here, and what we're already seeing happening in terms of the dissolution of due process and the unleashing of federal police forces on citizens and the killings of human rights activists on the streets, all of which were hallmarks of the Latin America that the United States helped to create through its acts of foreign interference and CIA-backed coups. And now we're seeing it on our streets, and And this is only the beginning. I mean, they're really planning to take what they have done in Latin America and make it a reality here, which is crazy because Trump and his people are always complaining about immigrants turning the United States into the third world. And they are the ones who have made the United States into the image of Latin America that they've long vilified and that they played a role in creating.
Well, let me just read a little paragraph from your New York Times op-ed, Jean. MAGA Republicans often complain that the United States is turning into the third world because of immigration, but it's Mr. Trump who has remade the United States in the image of Latin America that our government and chief executives helped create with foreign interference, a place where masked men routinely leap out of unmarked vans to snatch citizens, where people are disappeared and human rights activists publicly killed, where soldiers patrol cities to crush dissent, and where organized crime and the state blend into a single machinery of power that protects the interests of the oligarchs. And when you talk about Trump imposing this new order or disorder on Latin America, he's already shown clearly in the United States what his preferences are. He's been freeing crooks and fraudsters on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the conditions that they're creating in Latin America are conditions that are going to fuel new waves of mass migration, which I think is the point that I really hope people don't miss from my essay, because that is the reality that I think we're going to see here, given the policies that he's putting into place here. We're going to see mass displacement. That is the logical outcome of the Trump policies that are being put into place right now, where this sense of pervasive insecurity and an ability to have economic mobility, it's going to end up forcing people to become migrants in the United States, just like we're seeing happening with the dictators that they're installing in Latin America. We're not seeing the impact quite yet in terms of mass migration, but ultimately it's so interesting when you see he's deporting immigrants in the United States who have deep ties, who have homes, who have US citizen children, who have jobs, and who have some level, however small, of mobility and power. He's deporting that population of undocumented immigrants, and they're going to ultimately be replaced by new waves of immigrants that are not rooted in this country and don't have property and don't have any sort of power here, and they're just going to be easier to exploit. And then you look at the people who he's stripped of status, and at the end of the day, it appears that he's created a larger undocumented population than he has removed.
But it doesn't have to be this way. For example, all the efforts at immigration reform have been stymied largely by Republicans. There was an effort more recently under Trump where the Liberal Senator Chris Murphy, along with Conservative Senator Langford, Republican of Oklahoma, came up with a immigration reform. Trump deliberately told the Republicans not to vote for it because he wanted this issue as an open wound to exploit. And it's clear that you could have an immigration policy regime where people could come and go and work in the United States and live in the countries from which they come. But none of this would work unless you make life more livable in these countries like Mexico and Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, etc. But then you have to go basically champion democracy and get rid of organized crime. Exactly. So Trump's doing the opposite.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's doing the opposite, and he is also supporting a strategy of quote unquote development that has always been shown to displace people rather than actually create economic opportunities, which is this extraction by multinational corporations for the benefit of CEOs who don't have any interest in those countries.
Right, and that's his friend Roger Stone weighed in along with Matt Gaetz on behalf of Peter Thiel and Andreessen and these Silicon Valley oligarchs who are behind Prospera, this island in Honduras, which they want to turn into a freedom city. But let's go just in the last couple of minutes, so for just some context here on the history of the recent political history of Honduras. There was a coup by the military back in 2009 against Zelaya, whose wife more recently became the President Castro. And he was branded as kind of a communist type, disciple of Fidel Castro, when in fact he was basically more like Bernie Sanders.
Right.
But after that happened, that's basically when the explosion of crime happened, and the cartels took over. Yep. With Hernandez gaining into power for a decade, and that's when you had this massive migration to the United States, right?
Exactly. That's when you saw Obama dealing with the historic Central American migration crisis. It was when Juan Orlando Hernandez and the right-wing party were in power, and people were fleeing his narco state. And I mean, he was working with the cartels, and the cartels had free reign to kind of terrorize the population, and that's what led to people leaving.
So this essentially was a situation that we created, and ironically, the MS-13 gang, it was created here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
It became a real propaganda tool for Trump to demagogue, but here he is now working with the MS-13 to elect Tito Nasri.
Well, he advocated for the same candidate that MS-13 was going around posing as election observers, threatening to kill people and their families if they didn't vote for Asfuda. At the same time that Trump was going around saying, that there would be hell to pay if Hondurans didn't elect Asfuda. So they were operating on the same track, and the whole idea, I mean, Roger Stone wrote about it in his blog. Like, if Trump pardons Juan Orlando Hernandez and re-empowers the right-wing party, it will help to save Prospera. And that was the goal all along. It was to help these these Silicon Valley billionaires to be able to do whatever they want in Honduras, because Xiomara Castro, the democratically elected progressive president who was just in power and forced out, she opposed these startup cities, these startup zones, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were unconstitutional, and the Congress repealed the law that had put them into place. And I was actually listening to a podcast from a few months ago from one of the investors down there who was not worried whatsoever about the fact that Xiomara Castro and the Honduran government and the Honduran people were trying to reclaim their sovereignty, because they were like, well, we're going to make sure that we get a new administration in place that is in favor of our interests. We're going to be able to continue operating. They're just so used to operating with impunity that they don't seem to even blink when people are thwarting them, because they know that they can eventually move the chess pieces so that they're back in power. And that's what Trump did for them.
Well, Jean Guerrero, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jean Guerrero, who is a visiting professor at the USC Annenberg School of Journalism, and she is a contributing opinion columnist for the New York Times and a former opinion columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and previously was an investigative border reporter for NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and other public media. The recipient of an Emmy, she began her career at the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires as a correspondent in Mexico City, and is the author of Crux, a cross-border memoir, and most recently, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. And she has an op-ed at the New York Times, Trump is not a nationalist, he's something worse. We're going to take a brief station break, back looking into how Tulsi Gabbard's raid to get the 2020 ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, is a prelude to rigging the 2026 election.
I'm a-traveling down that road, so many have gone before, 100,000 workers along the ocean shore. Rich man took my home, he drove me from my door, and I ain't got no home in this world anymore. My brothers and my sisters are stranded on the road, highway marked with blood where 1,000,000 feet have trod. The gambling man is rich and the working man is poor, and I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Jeet Heer, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation and the host of the weekly Nation podcast, The Time of Monsters. He also pens the monthly column Morbid Symptoms, and his latest article at The Nation is Tulsi Gabbard's Georgia raid is a pretext for future election intimidation. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jeet Heer.
It's good to be on the program again.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jeet. And this administration is breaking all kinds of norms. There's nothing new there. But the idea that they arrested Don Lemon, who's hardly a radical journalist, he was actually making a documentary, making a news piece at a church in St. Paul back on January the 18th. And I saw the video report he did, and it was totally fair and balanced, to use that Fox term. He interviewed both sides and even called for both sides to come together. And yet he is being arrested on Pam Bondi's orders, while the two or several killers of American citizens, both in cases of Rene Good and Alex Preddy, they are not being questioned or tried or arrested. And now you've got the head of U.S. intelligence being sent down to Georgia on a political errand to look into the 2020 ballots in Fulton County, which is in itself an extraordinary move. So it seems to me that this move in Atlanta, Georgia, is not about the 2020 elections, but most likely about the 2026 elections.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it is a case that Trump is obsessed with the 2020 election. He made that as, one of the bases of his re-election campaign in 2024, that it had been robbed from him. And he brings it up in very unusual circumstances, as in the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, where he alleged that Maduro amazingly was involved with stealing the 2020 election. But I think that we have to understand these things, as in 2024, as a political project. This is a way of building support for Trump and also giving an ideological rationale for some of his actions. And it's exactly a forward-looking project looking towards 2026 and 2028. I think that Trump realizes that in any close election, he will have to use the levers of the power of the state to do so. And he's already tried many times. He tried when he was president to intimidate local state officials, famously in Georgia, saying, can they find him the 12,000 votes that he needs to win that state. And I think there's been a lot of resistance, local election officials, including, I have to add, Republicans, and a lot of resistance from judges, including Republican appointed judges, for this effort. But I think through Tulsi Gabbard, I think he's found a way to insert himself in the election process. And I think that should worry us all.
Well, in the case of Don Lemon, two judges, federal judges, refused to indict him. The second one was a clerk of Scalia's and was appointed by George W. Bush. And similarly now with this case in Fulton County, which involves Tulsi Gabbard, the special agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office, Paul Brown, he was removed because he questioned the Trump administration's rationale and legal standing to basically mine the 2020 ballots. And
yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of very unusual things that are going on in this Georgia case. The removal of the FBI field agent is one. The Democratic senator from Hawaii, Brian Schatz, has pointed out some other things. One of which is that the warrant that was used came from Missouri, not Georgia. So it seems like they were, got a judge in a separate state to allow them to do this. And the third thing is just the very involvement of Tulsi Gabbard. She is Director of National Intelligence. That was a position that was created after 9/11 to coordinate between intelligence agencies to deal with foreign threats, and that can apply to elections. But that's something that she's actually resisted. She dismantled the agency within the federal government that looks at election interference from abroad, and she is like interfering now in like a domestic election case, which is not under her purview at all. So there's a lot of very strange things that are happening in this case, things that sort of, really stretch the boundaries of what is legally permissible.
Well, Tulsi Gabbard is known in the Kremlin, so she's referred to as our girlfriend. And I must say that the behavior of the Department of Justice in this case, where they're rifling through ballots and stuff, is somewhat similar. I mean, in a way, what Trump was influenced by with his obsession about Georgia was this bizarre documentary that was made called 2000 Mules, which was screened at Mar-a-Lago. And it's completely bogus. It comes up with this notion that 2,000 black men were hired by George Soros to stuff these ballot boxes, these drop boxes, which then the Republicans then got rid of them all. And this is similar to, but in the real world, Putin had hired a bunch of people to stuff the ballot boxes in 2011 for his return after he swapped out with Medvedev. So I see the United States at the highest level behaving like the damn Kremlin.
Yeah, no, I think that there's something to that. I mean, this is like obviously that bogus documentary that you mentioned, which I believe was made by Dinesh D'Souza,
Yes.
uh, who had been convicted felon who had broken election laws and was subsequently pardoned by Trump. I mean, there's a kind of right-wing ideological project to engage in election suppression, election intimidation. And Georgia, like is a swing state. It's a state that went for Biden in 2020, for Trump in 2024, but that Republicans have been suffering there since Trump's election. And so I do think, this sort of follows a pattern of election intimidation. And it really goes against one of the sort of major principles, which is elections are monitored by the states. Now, in theory, one could hope for that the United States at some point will have kind of like, a federal independent election commission, as exists in many other democracies, advanced democracies, but they don't have that. And right now you have this kind of ramshackle system where it's done by the states, but Trump is not reforming that system. He's actually like making it much worse by, introducing this element of partisan federal interference. And so I think that's really the sort of like the danger that's at play here. And I think, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard has put herself straight in it. And this is a way for her self, like, I think we something can be said about Gabbard. Like she joined the Trump administration as a supposedly anti-war kind of voice, but has been sidelined in all foreign policy decisions. Has been, there's reporting that she was sidelined in both the bombing of Iran and in the Venezuela kidnapping. So she's like making a name for herself or trying to win loyalty points with Trump by doing this. And that's a very dangerous situation where you have a cabinet official that, tries to win cookies from the great leader by doing his bidding in violation of the law.
Well, again, though, Jeet, it's pretty clear that this is all about the 2026 and the 2028 elections, and that Fulton County is really at the electoral heart of Georgia in terms of the black vote. And they're also, the Republicans are hoping to knock off Democratic Senator John Ossoff, and that's a very key race. And he's, I think, a particularly good senator. He's one of the youngest senators, and they're going to spend endless amounts of money. I think Elon Musk is already ponying up money. So that's what this is all about, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think that that's very much a short-term goal. I mean, I think one can see the sort of other subsidiary things, which is that if they do lose the midterms, and I do think if they have elections and if they're reasonably honest, they're in big trouble. They're very far behind in the polls. But then Trump can create a kind of stolen election myth. And I think that Gabbard's involvement in all this is partially designed to give them a basis of support. So I think that they both want to intimidate the election to get their own results and also have a way of delegitimizing the Democrats if the Democrats win. And I think that puts American democracy in a very precarious position because, like it's a crucial part of a democracy that you have to have a loyal opposition and accept election results when they don't go your way. And I don't think that Trump is willing to do that. So it's a very dangerous situation.
But why do you think the public accepts all of these lies that have become sort of metastasized, like there's such a thing as voter fraud? It's incredibly rare. And, for example, Trump has never questioned the integrity of the 2024 presidential elections, which he won. So isn't it pretty obvious that you only question elections?
This is a logical thing. It seems very bizarre to think that the election of 2020, when Trump was president, was stolen, but then Biden would allow a fair election in 2024 to allow Trump to gain power, like when Biden, had power. So it seems like just on a logical basis, it doesn't make sense. But I think it's a very sort of convenient mythology for Trump. And I would dispute the idea that the public as a whole believes this stuff. I mean, maybe if you put an abstract question of election fraud, people are skeptical, but I think people would agree with that. But I mean, to the actual storyline that Trump is putting forward is really only believed by Republican partisans. But I mean, it suits them. Is a very convenient kind of mythology. And I would say the mythology has a broader appeal than any facts. I think myths speak to a larger worldview. And I think the real worldview is that there's a real America of white Christians who are the real citizens. And if elections don't go the way of white Christians, then something fishy has to be up. So, I mean, in a broader sense, I don't think Trump's base accepts the idea of a multiracial democracy. I mean, and that's why his lies have an appeal.
And little wonder they're targeting the black vote in Georgia, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, this is it's both Trump's innovation, but there's a longer history in the United States. Obviously going back to the period after Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, if you can't get the election results you can want, then you have to fix the electorate. And that often means, denying the electoral votes to people you don't like. But I mean, I would also advise listeners to say, these efforts are often counterproductive on the Republican side. And I think over the last decade or more, really throughout the 20th century, you've seen a real sort of surge of votes by people of color, particularly African Americans. And I think one of the reasons is that people see that their votes are being taken away from them. So I think the more publicity and attention that this gives, the more likely it is to be a counterproductive effort.
Well, didn't they pass a law in Georgia that if you give an LD voter standing in these long lines a bottle of water, it's a felony?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's obviously there's a lot of election intimidation, election suppression efforts. And one can even question a lot of these local boards. It does seem that the lines in majority black areas are always much longer. They receive much less service. So I mean, there's real problem with the electoral system. And so I mean, I also have to sort of caution, it's still a 50-50 system. Democrats win 50% of the time. And to the extent that they win, it is partially because they're able to mobilize the populations whose votes are being suppressed. And I think that, if one calls attention to it, as we're doing on this program, I think people are become all the more eager to vote.
Well, I hope that's the case, Jeet Heer, and I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Oh, thank you. It's always a great pleasure to be on this program.
Well, thank you, Jeet. And again, I've been speaking with Jeet Heer, who's a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and the host of the weekly Nation podcast, The Time of Monsters. He also pens the monthly column Morbid Symptoms. And his latest article at The Nation is Tulsi Gabbard's Georgia raid is a pretext for future election intimidation. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into how Pam Bondi's arrest of CNN anchor Don Lemon is a wake-up call to all journalists and media owners.
This is a public service announcement with guitar. Know your rights. All three of them. Number one, you have the rights not to be killed.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Ann Nelson, an author and lecturer in the fields of international affairs, media, and human rights, who was the director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism, where she created the first curriculum in human rights reporting. Her books include Red Orchestra, The Berlin Underground, and The Circle of Friends Who Resisted Hitler, and Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right, now out in an updated paperback version. And she has a film, Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism, War and Democracy, based on her book, Shadow Network. Welcome to Background Briefing, Ann Nelson.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Well, thanks for joining us, Ann. And your film, Bad Faith, that's streaming or somewhere soon, in a couple of weeks, on a new platform, an updated version. Is that right?
Actually, the original version has been streaming on Amazon Prime and YouTube and Tubi and other platforms. So it's widely available. And a new updated version is going to be released in about 2 weeks. So whereas the first one, which was released a year and a half ago, said, "Oh, we should be nervous about Project 2025" in the credits section, the new edition says we should have been nervous about Project 2025 because we're living with it right now.
Absolutely.
And it's not pretty.
Absolutely. It lives on like a zombie, in spite of the craziness from Trump.
And I'd like to say that we are very interested. I'm the historical consultant on the film, and I'm interviewed at length in it, including about my book, Shadow Network. And one thing that was really powerful for us in the release of the film last time around is that many communities across the country invited us to participate in local screenings. So I personally spoke at over 30 screenings in 18 states, most of them in the Midwest. And what was really powerful was to get 300 to 700 concerned citizens together in a theater where they could look around and see people from their community who were worried about defending democracy. And then they could go out to the lobby after the Q&A and talk about what they were actually going to do about it. So when this new version is released, it's going to go straight to the communities who request it. We're not going to do the film festival route that's traditional. It's going to go straight to the people that we hope can use it.
Well, I mentioned the contrast between the craziness of Trump and the hard, relentless, zealous work of people like Russ Vought, who's one of the authors, along with Kevin Roberts at the Heritage Foundation of Project 2025. They're the worker bees. You know, Trump's this insane show pony. And they're getting a lot done. So people think that somehow Trump's about to implode, which is possibly in the cards. Don't underestimate the zealousness of Russ Vought, who the chief of staff, in an interview that she shouldn't have given, obviously, mentioned that he's an absolute. So let's talk about, though, since you work in journalism and at the Columbia School of Journalism, what is your sense of how much the press are reacting to the arrest of Don Lemon and 8 others, including an independent journalist, Georgia Fort?
Well, they're covering it, which is their job. And we can see that, organizations who are there to defend the press, such as the Committee to Protect Journalists, will be strongly critical. I feel that these arrests are the warning shot across the bow, and there have been others as well. But am very concerned about them just wading in and arresting journalists who are covering demonstrations, but I'm much more concerned about the acquisition of major media platforms. So we've got Elon Musk with Twitter, we've got Ellison with CBS, which is tragic. We have Bezos doing massive layoffs at the Washington Post at the same time he's pouring money into the Melania documentary, so-called. So I'm very concerned about the way that they're compromising our actual journalistic information systems.
Well, it's pretty clear what happened here, and it's happening across the board, of course, with Trump, who has gone from a pathological narcissist to an absolutely untethered megalomaniac. And he's giving orders right, left, and center, and apparently they even contradict him the next day. It's totally out of control of the White House, as far as I'm told from people there. And it's pretty clear to me that he got on the phone and yelled at Pam Bondi and said, I want Don Lemon's head. And Bondi, the Attorney General, obliged. And she went ahead, and after two judges, by the way, had refused to indict Don Lemon for this January 18th coverage he gave of this protest in a church that was a pastor, it turns out to be the local head of ICE, Pastor Davis Easterwood. And one of the judges that refused to indict him was a clerk for Scalia and was appointed by George W. Bush. So she then decides, obviously under pressure from Trump, to go out and come up with this bogus indictment. In her statement on X said that what Don Lemon was doing was the intimidation of Christians and that we're coming after you. So this is a kind of declaration of war, but how much are they playing to the religious right, or is this just what I'm suggesting here, that these people, these sycophants that he's got in the highest positions in this government, will do anything he tells them to do, and he clearly is, giving orders right, left, and center.
Well, Ian, as you know, my preferred vantage point is 30,000 feet. So backing up, what I feel is happening is that the midterms are dominant in the minds of all of the people you're talking about, Russell Vought, Trump, everyone else. And they are seeing that the Minneapolis events have contributed to the massive erosion of support for Trump and the MAGA movement. So this is what, when I ran the Committee to Protect Journalists in the past, and this is what we call a chilling effect. If you start arresting or beating or even killing journalists in various international situations, other journalists take heed and back off from covering it. So this is how I would interpret it. They don't want Minnesota to become a national emblem of, let's say, civic virtue in the face of their operations. So if you remove the messenger and start with people who may be vulnerable, then you discourage, they believe, others. Now, notice that, there are very major news organizations that are active in Minnesota who are not the first in the line for arrest. And that's how this operates. It's sending a message to them. So I don't assume that this is a fit of pique on Trump's part. It might be. But I also see that it's a systematic means of trying to forestall the disastrous midterms that would await them otherwise.
But what I see in what's happening in Minnesota, though, Anne, is a sort of new form of hybrid citizen journalism where, but for these brave citizens who are out there recording what ICE is doing, and this goes back to the killing of George Floyd, a courageous young African-American woman, I think she's about 17 years old, filmed the online, in front of our faces, murder of this man by a Minneapolis policeman. In this case, after the government had lied so brazenly about the killing of Renee Good and of Alex Preddy, the evidence that we got from people standing by filming on their iPhones was able to completely destroy the cases of Stephen Miller. He was dictating, obviously, to Kristi Noem at their alternative reality. So in many ways, I see the mainstream press relying upon these citizen journalists who provide the evidence. Otherwise, the lies of the government would stand.
Right, but you also what that means now is that Trump and his allies are playing defense. So they were very quick to come out of the gate before there was any evidence presented and said Renee Good was at fault. She was trying to run down the federal agent, which was not true. And then they called Alex Preddy a domestic terrorist who was attacking the agents, which was not true. Now, if they control the media that goes to certain voting blocks, they can push that narrative, and they have, and the people will believe it because that's the information that they consume. So you're counting on this targeted media, now mostly on social media platforms, where people get it on basically a subscription ongoing basis, versus the other media that may come in virally from the people recording the facts and the news organizations, but they're being told to distrust this. So what you have right now in the United States is a situation of absolute information warfare. I mean, it's classic. We're just not used to it.
Right, but it is still the dominant factor, whether you believe your lying eyes. I mean, at the end of the day, the evidence presented by the videographers in both Renee and Good and Alex Preddy case is overwhelming, isn't it? I mean,
if that's what you see. But if you look at some of the Fox coverage, which I have, they do selective editing and they can make it inconclusive. I have not seen Fox fabricate video evidence, but I've seen them edited in such a way that you can't tell what's going on, and then they give the narrative, right, that they choose. So again, what we have right now is something like the 30% to 35% hardcore MAGA base, which is going to believe what they see piped into these information systems. They just do, and most of them appear to be unmovable. You've got, maybe 40% of these voters who tend to be college educated, tend to be more urban, tend to consume fact-based news. So that leaves this gap of, up to maybe 10% of people who will determine the outcome of the election, especially in selected districts, about a dozen districts that will determine the outcome of the midterms for the House of Representatives. So what we have right now is this war for their attention and their credence.
Well, in terms of the war, the role of the Murdochs and Musk, who has a very important platform, X, that is the most cynical of all, right? I mean, in other words, they know that they're lying. This is straight out of Putin's Russia, right? That we have become, or at least a part of our media, has become the Pravda of the government.
Yeah. And, of course, the difference is that the competing media and fact-based journalism and independent journalism still exist, and they're vigorous. They're under attack in many different ways. And in terms of, people get so focused on the national elite media like the New York Times and ABC and so on. But what is really politically significant right now is the local media and the trusted media in, again, these states that are battleground districts that will determine the outcome of the election. And that's still in a very desperate situation because the local newspapers, which tend to have fact-based reporting, have been under economic crisis for 20 years now, and a huge number of them have closed. So getting information to these people that is fact-based is really a big part of the challenge right now.
Well, you mentioned CBS News. There's a massive tragedy there, surely, because that's the legacy of Edward R. Murrow and Bill Paley and Walter Cronkite out the window, right? Yeah. And Trump has already been promised by the Ellisons that that they'll take over CNN and get rid of anchors that he doesn't like. And I'm wondering whether Don Lemon was on that list. I mean, after all, he did get fired, did he not?
Well, and I feel a lot of anger at the donors and the billionaires and the tech bros who understand the need for democracy because they have been driving blind in terms of media. You know, any one of a number of them could have bought CBS, could have bought the Washington Post, right? A lot of these media properties were going at bargain basement rates, but they're not attractive investments unless you look at them as an investment to sustain democracy, which they should. So a lot of the philanthropy has been looking the other way from media, and that's just been a colossal mistake.
Well, what about the model with The Guardian? I mean, as non-profits, as public service. Has anybody thought along those lines apart from The Guardian?
Well, yeah, although, The Guardian has struggled economically. Thank goodness it's still there because the reporting is excellent. And we had a good model with public broadcasting, NPR and PBS, but it was also vulnerable because of the structure. So when the federal government under Trump cut out its contributions, powerhouse stations like, the ones in the big city were able to raise funding to maintain them. But the ones that are most needed in the news deserts in the United States didn't have that subscriber base. They didn't have that income base to work from. So you have the weakest elements in the places you need it the most.
Right, there's 1,200 NPR and public radio stations across the country in rural areas where the only news access is Christian Broadcasting and Fox. And these small college and community stations are incredibly vulnerable and are shutting down because of lack of money. So I'm astounded that nobody on the right wing keep talking about George Soros. Where is the George Soroses to come and step in? It would cost nothing to get all of these small college and community stations functioning, and then you'd have at least a chance of penetrating inside of these news deserts, some truth.
Yeah, and I'm also really excited about a new media project called Get Real News. And people can find it at getrealnews.org. And that's taking fact-based journalism and distributing it in short videos on these on digital platforms like Instagram. So, if journalism needs to step up its game and people need to invest in it because it's in a period of economic transition and it's too important to ignore.
So just in closing then, and what do you think is going to happen with Don Lemon? It's such a bogus case. He was out here in Los Angeles covering the Grammys when he was arrested and arraigned, and there's no way in the world that they can pin anything on him. As I mentioned, they tried to indict him back in Minnesota. 2 judges turned it down, the second of whom was a former clerk of Scalia's and appointed by George W. Bush. And he just said there's no case here. So there's no case, but clearly... But
again, let's look at the pattern, right? So they arrest him, they make the headlines, the journalists are concerned. Do the journalists change their coverage based on their anxiety? I don't know. This celebrated case gets some strong lawyers to come in and argue his case before the lower level judges. And unless the Trump administration wants to appeal it all the way up, he'll probably be okay. Because by that time, the Trump administration will have moved on to new targets. So we're looking at this cat and mouse game that's going to be going on for the next 8 months with increasing intensity.
Well, Ann Nelson, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and onward.
Onward, indeed. And again, I've been speaking with Ann Nelson, who's an author and lecturer in the fields of international affairs, media and human rights, who was the director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism, where she created the first curriculum in human rights reporting. Her books include Red Orchestra, The Berlin Underground, and The Circle of Friends Who Resisted Hitler, and Shadow Network, Media Money, and The Secret Hub of the Radical Right, now out in an updated paperback version. And her film Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's War on Democracy, based on her book Shadow Network, is streaming in 2 weeks' time. An updated version will be available on, what were the platforms again?
It is currently on Amazon Prime and Tubi and YouTube, and the updated version we're bringing straight to the communities, so people who are interested in hosting a screening should go to the Bad Faith documentary website and fill out a form.
Thank you so much. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
By 9:30.